There are royal stories that arrive like a trumpet blast, all gold braid and official statements, and very serious men walking briskly through very old hallways. And then there are the other stories, the ones that creep in sideways, the ones that start as a whisper, then a headline, then three headlines, then suddenly the internet is acting like it has broken into a locked room at Buckingham Palace and found a folder stamped with the word chaos. And that is exactly the kind of story we are dealing with here. Because if you have been anywhere near royal gossip, palace commentary, scandal channels, tabloid chatter, or those very intense comment sections where everyone somehow becomes half historian, half detective, and half body language expert. Yes, I know that is three halves, but honestly royal watchers do that a lot. Then you have probably seen the latest claims swirling around Prince Andrew, and by extension, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie. And let me be very clear right from the start, because in stories like this, the difference between confirmed fact and highly dramatic palace rumor matters a lot. A lot of what is being discussed publicly is still in the world of claims, insider talk, alleged tensions, and people reading institutional moves like tea leaves in expensive china. So we are not treating every whisper like a sworn court filing here. We are talking about the atmosphere, the panic, the optics, and the reason this story has people in the US, the UK, and honestly far beyond both, watching like it is the final season of a prestige drama nobody can stop live commenting. Because the claim now is explosive. The claim is that Andrew's daughters are facing a deeply uncomfortable reckoning, that private crisis talks are looming, that palace support is thinning, that doors once quietly left open are now being closed with a kind of polished, royal calm that somehow feels even colder than an actual argument. And if that sounds dramatic, that is because this is not just about one family having a terrible week. This is about a monarchy deciding whether blood still buys protection. That is the real story. Not the hats, not the carriages, not the smiling balcony choreography where everyone looks like they have been trained from birth to wave without revealing a single authentic thought. No, the real story is whether the institution has decided that survival now matters more than sentiment. And once you start looking at it through that lens, everything gets darker and, frankly, more interesting. Because for years, Beatrice and Eugenie occupied a very strange position in the royal orbit. They were never exactly at the center in the way William and Catherine are. They were not the faces of the future, but they were not completely on the outside either. They lived in that awkward in-between zone that royal families seem to specialize in, where you are visible enough to benefit from the association, but distant enough that the palace can pretend your problems are not really palace problems until, suddenly, they absolutely are. And for a long time, that arrangement sort of worked. A lot of people looked at the York sisters and thought, well, whatever you think about their father, why should they carry all of that on their shoulders? Why should they be punished for a scandal they did not create? Why should daughters spend years paying for the reputational catastrophe of a parent? That argument had emotional power. It still does. But here is the brutal thing about monarchy. It is not really built on fairness. It is built on optics. It is built on symbolism. It is built on the idea that every face in the frame tells a story about the institution itself. And once an institution becomes frightened enough, it stops asking, is this fair? It starts asking, is this safe? That is a very different question. And according to the growing wave of palace reporting and insider-style commentary, that question is now hanging directly over Beatrice and Eugenie. Because the chatter is not just about Andrew anymore, it is about proximity, it is about association, it is about whether the royal family, especially under the influence of William and Anne, has entered a phase where technically not involved is no longer considered good enough. Think about that for a second. For decades, the monarchy often functioned like a grand old house with too many locked rooms. If something awkward happened in one wing, the instinct was not to tear the place open and check the plumbing. The instinct was to close the door lower the curtains, and hope the public became distracted by a christening, a jubilee, or someone wearing a sapphire the size of a small moon. But that old method does not work the same way anymore. We live in an age where scandal does not fade politely. It mutates, it archives itself, it gets clipped, reposted, subtitled, translated, turned into explainers, podcasts, documentaries, and late-night commentary threads with 15 screenshots and one person saying, "I'm just asking questions," right before asking the least casual question you have ever seen in your life. So if you are the palace and you are looking at the Andrew problem, you are not looking at a finished scandal. You are looking at a contamination risk. And that is where the story gets very cold. Because one of the loudest symbolic claims in all of this is the idea that Beatrice and Eugenie are being frozen out of key royal appearances, especially Royal Ascot. Now, for anyone outside the UK, and honestly for quite a few people inside the UK as well, Royal Ascot can look like a very fancy horse event where rich people compete to see who can wear the most structurally confusing headpiece before noon. And sure, on the surface, yes, there is some truth there. But in royal terms, Ascot is not just horses and hats. It is hierarchy, it is placement, it is visibility, it is who is in, who is out, and who gets to be seen as part of the polished public family portrait. So if a royal is missing from that picture, especially in a way that feels deliberate, that absence speaks loudly. It says this person is not currently useful to the image we are trying to present. It says we are drawing a line. It says the institution has started choosing the frame more carefully than before. And if the claims are true that William has pushed for a tougher internal standard, then what we may be watching is not a one-off snub. We may be watching the beginning of a doctrine. A new royal doctrine. One that says, if you cannot help the monarchy, you will not be allowed to complicate it. That sounds harsh, but look at the direction of travel here. Charles, for all his instincts toward continuity, has also spent years trying to slim things down, tighten the machine, reduce the visible clutter around the central brand. William, meanwhile, has increasingly been described as even more hard-edged on the issue of reputational risk. Anne, of course, has long had the energy of the one relative who would absolutely read the policy manual, rewrite the policy manual, then silently judge everyone who had not already memorized page 17. So put those three forces together: Charles's need for institutional survival, William's intolerance for chaos, Anne's iron sense of duty, and suddenly the York situation starts to look less like family drama and more like a strategic cleanup operation. And that is the part people find chilling. Because if this really is about a new standard, then the old royal safety net may be disappearing. No more endless grace period. No more indefinite, let's not make this worse. No more assumption that being born into the system guarantees you a permanent place within it. Instead, the message becomes, comply, clarify, distance, or go dim. And once you imagine the palace thinking that way, the rest of the story almost writes itself. You can picture the meetings, can't you? Not loud, not theatrical. That is not how these things happen. Palace power is often at its most ruthless when it is quiet. A folder placed on a table, a recommendation phrased in language so measured it almost sounds gentle, a schedule adjusted, an invitation not sent, a seating plan reconsidered, a public role slowly evaporating while everyone insists nothing dramatic is happening at all. That is how modern royal exile works. Not with a slammed door, with a calendar. And that brings us to the most emotionally charged angle of this whole saga, which is the idea that Beatrice and Eugenie may have believed they could keep balancing two worlds indefinitely. On one side, loyalty to their father. On the other, continued comfort within the wider royal structure. In human terms, that is understandable. Painfully understandable, actually. Family loyalty is messy enough in ordinary households. Now imagine trying to navigate it while the press is circling. Your surname is one of the most famous on earth, and every appearance gets interpreted like a coded message. But institutions are not sentimental in the way families are. That is the trap. A daughter can think, that is still my father. The monarchy thinks, that is still our problem. And those two truths do not sit together easily. So when people say the sisters are reportedly distressed, horrified, shaken, blindsided, whatever word the latest source has chosen, I can believe that the emotional pressure would be intense. Because even if you spent years defending your position, even if you told yourself that the worst had already happened, there is always a difference between living under a cloud and realizing the cloud has now entered the building. That is when the panic starts. That is when you understand that this might not blow over. That is when you start hearing phrases like transparency, protocol, review, compliance, and you suddenly realize palace language has become dangerous. Because here is another thing worth noticing. Whenever stories like this talk about ethics procedures, disclosures, financial reviews, or internal concerns, the actual details are often murky, but the symbolism is razor sharp. The palace does not need to prove every rumor in public to make an internal judgment about risk. It just needs to decide that uncertainty itself has become unacceptable. And in the age of reputational crisis, uncertainty can be enough. That is the uncomfortable truth. You do not even need a full scandal to trigger royal panic anymore. Sometimes the possibility of future embarrassment is enough. Sometimes the fear of a headline is enough. Sometimes the mere chance that a past association might become tomorrow's public disaster is enough to make the institution move first and explain never. And that is why so many royal watchers believe William's influence matters here. Because William, fairly or unfairly, has come to symbolize a colder future for the monarchy. Streamlined, controlled, less forgiving, more focused on the crown as a brand that cannot survive another era of family freelancing and scandal spillover. And if you are sitting in that worldview, then Andrew is not just a disgraced relative. He is a warning label. A reminder of what happens when privilege, denial, entitlement, and disastrous judgment collide in public view and refuse to disappear. Which means the real fear inside palace walls may not be yesterday's scandal at all. It may be repetition. The royal family can survive many things: awkward relatives, petty feuds, ceremonial boredom, even bad interviews, though not all of them, and yes, some interviews enter history like flaming meteorites and never stop glowing. But what it struggles to survive is the sense that it learns nothing, that it protects the wrong people for too long, that the same patterns keep returning with new packaging. That is the nightmare. And if the palace thinks the York connection, however personal, however complicated, however emotionally painful, risks dragging old poison into a new era, then the logic becomes very simple. Cut the cord. Not necessarily in one public swing. That would be too messy, too emotional, too visible. No, monarchy likes to perform surgery wearing velvet gloves. So you get distance. You get reduced appearances. You get quieter schedules. You get less access, less visibility, less assumption. You get a future in which some royals remain technically royal while becoming practically peripheral. And maybe that is what we are seeing take shape now. Because while all this storm talk swirls around the York sisters, the contrast being set up elsewhere in the monarchy is impossible to miss. On one side, the whisper of exclusion. On the other, the image of renewal, stability, recovery, duty. The reliable, polished figures the palace wants front and center. That contrast is everything. It says this is the face of the future, and this is what is being left behind. And whether you are a loyal monarchist, a fascinated outsider in America, a scandal watcher in Australia, or just someone who somehow fell down a royal YouTube rabbit hole at 2 in the morning and never fully escaped, you can feel the drama in that shift. This is not just gossip. It is curation. The monarchy is editing itself in real time. And let's be honest, that is why people cannot stop watching. Because at the center of all this ritual and pageantry is something incredibly human. Fear, shame, loyalty, image, survival, family members who love each other but cannot save each other, institutions that speak in tradition while acting out pure self-preservation, public figures smiling for cameras while knowing entire decisions may be unfolding in rooms they are not even in. It is brutal, it is fascinating, it is very royal. And maybe the most haunting part is this: if the palace really has entered a harder, more disciplined phase, then Beatrice and Eugenie may only be the beginning of the lesson. Because once an institution discovers that decisive distance earns public approval, it tends to keep using that tool. That is how standards become systems. That is how one exclusion becomes precedent. That is how a family monarchy starts behaving more like a survival machine. And maybe from the palace point of view that is necessary, maybe they look at the last decade and think there is simply no other option. Too many scandals, too many own goals, too many moments where private misjudgment became public damage. Maybe they truly believe the only path forward is to make examples where they once made excuses. But of course, there is a cost to that. There is always a cost. Because the more ruthlessly a monarchy protects itself, the more clearly it reveals what it really is. Not just a family, not just a symbol, but an institution that will preserve the crown even when that means emotionally amputating the people closest to it. That is not a fairy tale. That is statecraft in a tiara. And honestly, that may be the oldest royal story of all. Not who wore what, not who smiled at whom, not even who sat in which carriage, but who gets sacrificed when the institution feels threatened. That is the question now hanging over this entire mess. If the claims are true, if the distancing is real, if the frost behind the scenes is as sharp as people say, then what we are watching is not just another awkward chapter for the York branch. We are watching the monarchy send a message to itself. No one is untouchable anymore. Not the embarrassing uncle. Not the sympathetic daughters. Not the relatives who thought there would always be one more chance, one more invitation, one more careful public compromise. And once that message has been sent, it cannot really be unsent. So yes, tell me what you think, because I already know the comment section is going to have opinions. A lot of opinions. Do you think the palace is doing what it has to do? Do you think Beatrice and Eugenie are being unfairly punished for a scandal that was never theirs? Do you think William's version of monarchy is the only realistic future? Or is this the moment where discipline starts looking suspiciously like coldness? Drop your thoughts below, because this is one of those stories where every angle says something different depending on what you think the monarchy is supposed to be. A family, a symbol, a machine, or all three badly welded together, and praying the cameras do not zoom in too close. And if you enjoy this kind of royal deep dive, where we take the polished image, turn it around slowly, and look at the cracks in the gold leaf, make sure you subscribe, leave a like, and stay close, because this story does not feel finished. Not even slightly. In royal scandals, the first whisper is almost never the last one. And that is what makes them so hard to look away from. Thanks for watching.